Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Emin Askerov, and welcome to another episode of What's Up with Startups, a podcast where I talk with founders, operators, investors about scaling up climate hardware. And today I have a very special guest with me. Is Jim Stonecipher. Hello, Jim.
Emin.
And it's really great to have you here because, we didn't know each other before. Some of the guests on my podcast I know from way back, but I heard about you first time. I stumbled upon somebody sharing an article of an interview with you, and that interview was an obscure journal for me, like a Jet Fuel Intelligence.
Jet Fuel Intelligencer. Yeah. Christina House wrote the piece with me, and it was an absolute pleasure. And the hard part was keeping it to 2,000 words.
Yeah. So I was reading it, and I was like, that finally, I'm reading an article from a person who actually done first of a kind, hardware scale up in climate. And he's talking about it in very open terms and very frank about what happened, what went wrong, and so on. And what was your role in this? I absolutely have to meet this person. So I reached out, and thank you very much for being so responsive and agreeing to be a guest on my podcast. So for those who don't know Jim has, I think, over 30 years of experience in all things climate tech. And I think you've done batteries, you've done sustainable aviation fuel, you've done hydrogen. So I usually boast that I did wind farms and wind turbines and batteries, two things in climate tech, but you actually done at least three, I think. There's even maybe, is there something I missed?
No, the early stage of the career is really still, like many folks, you start out with a larger corporate type environment. You learn your trade as an engineer, you develop your different skill sets, and eventually kind of move through different roles and gain a lot of experience around that. And I had the ability to do that on multiple fronts, where it was both, technical and technical leadership, doing project development, going through the engineering phases of large scale projects, all the way through building operations teams from the ground up and leading them through building out entire large scale facilities, creating that team and the structure and all the leadership positions underneath it. It's been, in many ways, it's been a very natural progression, but, it still kind of comes all the way back to, where do your skills lie and how are you chasing after your goals and how things come together.
Okay. For you, I think things came together now at the company you work for, which you founded, is called EdyMac. And to tell, as a way of introduction, what brought you to EdyMac after all that journey you had in climate tech?
Yeah. And, for me, it was, I'd been with Fulcrum for 5 years. So that was the very first real startup that I had been in, was Fulcrum. And the premise of Fulcrum was municipal solid waste into a jet fuel. So that was the basics. And we went through the construction of the plant, had struggles with the installation, had a global pandemic during the middle of all of this, had issues with the contractors. So a lot of different headwind. At a certain point we got to in the startup, I knew where things were going to head. It was not going to go and land in some beautiful place and everyone was going to be happy and it was going to be joyous. It was going to end up being a problem. And so from my perspective, I chose to step back before everything came to a crashing end and said, I've got lots of experience. I've been involved in multiple aspects of project development through due diligence on both sides of the table, through developing teams, starting up plants, looking at technology. Maybe I should put that to work for others so that I can help bring them along and utilize my, like you said, 30 years worth of experience around multiple areas and help them gain some knowledge where I had to gain it through wisdom, which the difference is you learn it yourself with one and you learn it from others with knowledge. So that was really the genesis of where I decided to set up EdyMac. And EdyMac actually comes from my philosophy around the choices you make set your destiny. And that really comes all the way down to the name itself, because EdyMac stands for every day you make a choice. It's the first letter from that whole phrase. So
cool.
that to me has been, a key central philosophy for me in terms of the choices we make set our destiny, because ultimately every choice you have, or the lack of a choice is still a choice, becomes a consequence in the end, whether that's a consequence that you desire or whether it's a consequence you don't desire. Those choices are important. My basic philosophy in my company is, how do I help others go through making the choices they need to create the businesses? Because it's never an obvious choice. It's never something that's clear cut. It's always very murky and gray, and you don't necessarily understand what are the potential effects of those choices that may not show up for years within your project or your business strategy. So that's where I try to help others.
So just let's dive a little bit into this. You help by providing advisory, correct, to scale ups from your experience as an operator.
And there's a lot of different facets around that I bring to bear. I'm working with folks that are literally in a pre-seed. I've been with companies that are in Series A. I've gone through all the way and done Series D for fundraising and successful Series D, an unsuccessful Series E. But having been through all of these things, I'm able to see both as you progress your company and you go from pre-seed and friends and family and those kind of fundraising efforts to just get yourself moving forward. How do you start to try to build the rigor into your business plan? At what point do you need to start having the additional, outer support for, say, your engineering or your technology? When do you start bringing in independent engineers to bring that view to the table so that you're able to show the investors and people that are interested in your technology that here's the things that are strong, here's how they're demonstrated either through actual applications, or how you're taking an actual application and going down a tangential route to create a new use with what you're doing, and how do the business economics stand up behind that? Are they reasonable? Are they rational? What's the overall strategy? Is your strategy to be completely a technology provider? Is your strategy to be a full end-to-end supply chain supplier? And how do you create all of those elements in between and just continue to build out the rigor within that business model over the course of time as you get stronger and stronger?
So you mentioned Fulcrum BioEnergy. We're going to come back to that, but not at the moment, although I did enjoy very much reading that article, but we will talk about Fulcrum BioEnergy. I want to ask you about Air Liquide. You worked for over 13 years in Air Liquide, and I mean, you worked on the hydrogen, I think, when it was like in vogue, I would say. But then you left for Fulcrum BioEnergy. And I mean, why would an executive with your CV, leave this very, at that time at least, successful and a bright future scale up and join something which is, most dangerous phase in its whole lifetime?
It's interesting, but it really comes back to, when I looked at alternatives to Air Liquide, the reason behind it was, Air Liquide was not really trying to challenge me and push me forward. It was very happy to keep me in the role where I was contributing well. I had a team of people that were located across the country, so it was multiple sites, multiple states, a lot of travel involved with that.
Just sorry to interrupt you, Jim. Just for the listeners and viewers, I mean, you had the position of operations director from 2011 to 2019, I think,
2011 right? I left the company right at the end of 2018.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
a lot of time in that role. And I spent almost 7 years as the operations director with 5 different facilities under my responsibility, which meant I had 5 different plant managers. So each one of those unique in terms of both the individual who's leading the team, the customer that they're facing, because these were all customer facing roles. This was an over the fence supply. So if your plant has a problem, you're having to talk to Chevron or Shell or Phillips 66 and explain to them why you're costing them $1 million a day in profits. And when are you going to have your problem fixed? So I had some extremely business savvy individuals working with me that I was developing, promoting them to other roles, growing them through the company, creating a great pipeline for talent. And Air Liquide just wasn't doing that with me. After a period of time, when you have these continued conversations of, what's next? Where can I get new challenges? How can I contribute to the business in,
Mhm,
more impactful ways than I'm currently doing? And it was always a one-way conversation and
mhm,
there was never a response. And so at a certain point, you really either develop your own people like I was doing with my team, or they're going to find somebody else that can develop them and grow them and give them other
mhm,
opportunities. So I ultimately chose to take that other opportunity, and genuinely, I've never looked back since then. I mean,
mhm,
it allowed me to do much more than I ever would have been able to do within Air Liquide. It exposed me to not just building teams associated with new facilities. It exposed me to how do you build business management systems? How do you build operational systems from the ground up? How do you
yeah.
create entire businesses from nothing and make them so that they're adjustable and scalable as you get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so that's something I never would have been able to do with Air Liquide.
Very interesting that say you are now a startup comes to you as an advisor, and they're like in a similar position to Air Liquide,
Mhm, mhm,
say, and the founder and CEO ask you, "Look, Jim, I have this very nice operations director. Really like the guy. Really solves all the issues for me, but I think he's getting bored. I mean, but I really like to keep him.
mhm.
How do I do that? Or should I do that? I mean, if I could like inverse this problem back to you,
Yeah, yeah.
how would you approach that? I mean,
Well,
from general principles perspective. Yeah.
the thing is in a startup environment, you really don't have too many of those problems because let's say you have a very skilled but narrowly focused operationally driven individual, but
Hmm.
it's a startup. In a startup, there is never one hat that you wear. You will
Sure.
take off your operations hat and put on your, hey, I'm customer facing hat today. Oh, I need to work with someone fundraising. So that means I need
Mm.
to take my operational story and begin to craft it in a way that an investor can understand it in literally about 2 sentences. Because if you can't get your message across a finance person in 2 minutes or sentences, then you've lost them because they're already thinking about where else can I put my money that is gonna make me money. So you've got to really get in there, get very concise. So there's so many different areas that people can play in, and if they're that narrowly focused, it's one of two issues. Either they're not interested in moving outside of that spectrum and getting the
Mhm.
exposure to the finance, the investment, the growth areas of the business, or they're being confined into that range and they're being forced into that lane. And that's not an individual's problem. That's a leadership problem.
But could you say that then, for example, you would for actually have two phases. So
Mhm.
one phase of business would be like when you go from pilot to first of a kind, and then the other phase where you go from first of a kind to nth of a kind, where you just
Mhm.
replicate.
Yeah,
And would you agree that for each of the phase you probably would need different people?
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, your skill sets are going to change over the course of the growth of the company. And in some ways they're going to become more narrowed because the needs of the company and the business are changing a little bit, but also because now then, as you're going from that first of a kind to the nth of a kind, your bandwidth around those certain swim lanes is getting wider. So it's taking more of that individual's attention to give it the necessary bandwidth to be accomplished in that. So you're starting to get into some specializations at that point, and you're getting less crossovers between all of these areas. It's a startup. You still have to have a very matrixed organization so that your operations people are working very much with your finance people, whether that's on the day to
Mm-hmm.
day purchase to pay and where am I at financially with the current operations, or
Mm-hmm.
building out with, well, what does the N+1 facility need to look like? How do we create the financial models around that? So
Yeah.
you're still going to have a lot of that overlap that comes within those areas. But as you grow, the bandwidth within each lane begins to expand, and it just takes up more of one individual's attention during that time frame.
Okay. All right. Let's stay on the topic of hiring people for folk projects, but transition now to Fulcrum, as I promised.
Hmm.
So when you started at Fulcrum, what I read is that you hired, I think, over 80 people.
I ended up bringing in over 100 people when it
Over
was.
100, yeah. Well,
Yeah,
that's a lot. I mean, I,
yeah.
I myself started companies were from 5 to 300
Mhm.
in like in the space of like 2 or 3 years. It was every time it was like a bit crazy. And could you describe what is your method? What is your process for hiring, onboarding people? Because when you have this 5 or about 15 and then you grow by 100, that's a very, very intense and very hard process to manage. I know from my experience. I mean, tell me,
It can be. It can be.
what is your secret sauce?
The first thing that you got to look for, and I've looked for this both when it's been in, more mature organizations or in the startup organization. You need to look for people that bring a level of adaptability and initiative. Not every role in the organization needs to have the kind of self-starting initiative that says, I'm the newest hire, I have the lowest skills but I aspire to be the CEO. No, you need to have a level of initiative of how do you begin to develop yourself? How do you begin to support the team? And I want to adapt. I want to change because my environment is going to change. Every day that I show up to work, it's different than it was yesterday. Sometimes it's a small difference. Sometimes it's a large difference. You never know, but you've got to have that ability to adapt. And the adaptability is truly key when it comes to a startup, because my takeaway has been when you sit down and you make your business plan and you say, I need all of these different roles to fill these different positions and have these functions that are available to us, you truly only know maybe half of what you need. You don't know the other half. You don't even know what those skill sets you need are yet. It's a mystery that's behind a veil. So you have to have people that can come in and have that adaptability to say, look, we found out where we have a gap here. This is an area that is going to be rapidly expanding and we need someone to focus on it. Can you adapt to this skill set? Do you have the initiative to learn what you need to be able to take on this additional skill? Let me help you with providing the right resources, whether that's knowledge, whether that's tools, whether that's, sitting down and getting training, perhaps even, some of those things occur. But if you don't have an adaptable person that is willing to take a level of initiative and you have someone who says, I'm just here to work. I'm going to put my 8 hours in today. I'm going to do what's right here in front of me on my desk. I'm going to read my emails and I'm going to respond to everything that I can within my 8 hours. And then I'm going to hit the clock and I'm going home. And I'm not thinking about this until I show up tomorrow morning. You've got to have people that really, take that initiative back with them. They don't necessarily do work at home, but they're thinking about stuff when they're sitting at home. They're thinking about, how do I become a better person? How do I expand my own abilities and learn more so that I'm contributing more? And then, if you've got those kind of people on board, then the next part of it, the onboarding side of it, right? You've got the right talent that you're working with, whether they bring the direct skills that you need or whether they can learn and adapt to those skills. The next part of it is really coming down to creating the goals and objectives so everyone understands, what are we trying to achieve here? What is the business trying to achieve? And you're doing that on a shorter time frame. It may be on a quarterly basis, it may be on an annual basis, but it's somewhere in that time frame. It's not everybody, we're going to develop this technology and we're looking to exit the business in 7 to 10 years. It's how do we look to develop this technology? And here's the near milestone that we're looking to achieve here. Here's how you contribute to making that a success. Here's the overall. You need to understand the overall vision and the direction, but here's how you, all the way down to the newest person who showed up this morning, how do you help make that objective a reality? And then from there, you start getting them to buy in with, by sweeping the floor every day, I'm helping create the workspace that then can help the next guy achieve his goal, who can then help the next guy achieve his goal. So each and every person has a contribution towards that success. And when they can see their contribution being really at the same equal level as anyone within there, it's just, they have a different role. They're more of the quarterback. This is more of the person who does this type of role, all the way down to the guy who is managing the soccer balls on the side of the field and making sure they're inflated to the right pressures, right? Everyone is important in achieving that ultimate objective. And when they understand that, now then everybody's moving in the right direction. And you have the ability for leaders and supervisors to provide feedback around both,
Mhm.
here's how we are in reaching our objectives, whether that's good or
Mhm.
bad, but here's where we are, the reality of where we are. And then you as
Okay.
an individual, here's how your contributions have helped make that happen. And here's how we're going to move that forward. And that feedback can either be the positive sides of here's how you really did a good job on helping us achieve that goal, or here's how we could do it better next time. Because and it's not always negative feedback, because sometimes it's you make the choices in the moment with what you readily have available, but tomorrow morning you may be a little smarter. You may have learned something else that would then have influenced your decision differently. So you learn from those things, both what did you do and how did you analyze it after the fact to understand maybe I would have made a different decision and a different choice.
Okay. But what you mentioned about hiring people is you mentioned this adaptability and initiative,
Mhm.
which are of course like super important for any startup scale up to have people like that. But how do you actually look for that? When you interview the candidate, how you say, okay, I know this guy, he's adaptable and he's able to take initiative because there is something that either he did before or he said to
Mhm.
me, or maybe I set him up some task or and then he showed so how you kind of because everybody tells you in their
Mhm.
CV, I'm
Oh, yeah.
responsible person, hardworking. And
Yeah.
then the moment you hire them, that's it. 6 o'clock in the evening, that they gone. And then next day they whine to you
Mhm.
about when this is just a mess. All this
Yeah.
company when it's just we're going to have
Mhm.
structures and why the legal department is not doing its job and so on and so forth. Hmm.
So let's maybe talk about the initiative side first, because I think that's one of the
Okay.
more easily seen items from my perspective. You look at somebody's CV, you can begin to see, is someone trying to help push themselves along? Is someone trying to help adapt themselves? Did they, all the way at the very beginning of their career, it may be something very simple. They graduated their high school and went straight into a college. Well, what did they do during college? How did they, conduct themselves? Did they work with teams? Did they work with other social groups to help build things, to help create things, to help support maybe charitable causes like, you see in different fraternities and sororities? You can begin to see, or did they just, I was a member of this fraternity, I went to school, I graduated. You're starting to see some of these little tattletales very early in their career, and then does that continue as they start to grow and mature in their craft? Even if it's someone, one of my best examples is, let's say someone graduates from high school, but they want to be a technician, but they don't want to be an engineer or a business manager or a finance manager. They like to work with their hands. They like to
Okay.
get very immediate feedback on how are things performing. I like to be around machines, for instance. So how did they grow that skill set? Well, they chose to go to school to do that, just like many of us went to college, and they began to learn that skill set. Was that school right there where they grew up? Was that school somewhere else and they had to relocate for it? And why did they choose that school? Did it have a good reputation? Did it have an experienced track record of producing people that had high talent within that skill set that they were learning? You're beginning to see they do take initiative around things. They're willing to put forth the effort to try to reach something that's just a little bit higher. And they may not realize that at first, but it's something that comes along. So there's a
Mhm.
lot of ways that you could really pull back on, are they taking the initiative? Are they looking to try to expand themselves? And as you begin the conversation with them, how are they demonstrating that currently? How are they continuing to do that? All the way to how do they conduct themselves in their own life? Well, in my spare time, I volunteer somewhere. My
Mhm.
wife and I do these other things. My wife has a business and I help her. She likes to bake cookies, for instance. And so I help her bake the cookies and put the cookies in boxes, all of
Mhm.
these things. That shows you they take initiative. That shows you they are team players. There's lots of these little things that are out there. You just have to observe and be open to looking for them. So that's the initiative side of things. Let's talk about the adaptability side. I can't tell you everyone gets a very straight line path through their career. There is almost always some dodge left, dodge right for many different reasons. The business that you were in decided that they were going to sell that business to another business. Boom. Now you've got to change to a completely different business culture. Maybe they decided that they're going to get out of that business and they're shutting down
Hmm.
that business. And here you are now going, well, we have to find something new. I'm not independently wealthy. I need a job. I have to support myself. I have to support my family. How do they go through adapting to new areas? Do you see them working when they are on a career path within an organization, working on new skill sets and growing their skill sets? I was an engineer over here, but then I went and became more of an engineering manager. And then
Hmm.
I went over and did operations management, which is very different skill set than technical leadership. And then I did something more in a completely different area. Maybe I started doing some commercial areas. So now you're starting to see, are they adaptable? Can they change to a new skill set? And it doesn't mean that they have to be 100% successful in each one of those skill sets. You're gaining something every time you do something new. You're gaining a level of understanding. And that understanding may be as fundamental as, I understand that I don't like doing commercial work. I don't like negotiating contracts. So that's an important thing to understand. Where are your limits too? But now then you've gotten some experience around contracts, contract structure. What are some of the areas that you need to maybe have some flexibility around? What are some areas that you need to say, no, these are sacrosanct. We can never violate these aspects of the contract. Otherwise, it makes it more difficult for us to really do business. So you've learned from that, even though you're not
Hmm.
writing contracts anymore, but you've
Yeah.
gained skill set around it. So adaptability still comes, but hiring people is one of the hardest things around because, essentially it's deciding to get married on a speed date. From my perspective, we also tended to use a bit more rigorous approach when it came to doing the interviews. We would start with people that I was looking to bring in, as my direct hires. I would interview them first myself, get a feel for where did I think their skills were, where did I think their behaviors were, how did I think
Hmm.
their adaptability, initiative, all of these things that I'm looking for. Then I would bring someone else into the conversation that I trusted that was already on my team. And let's both evaluate them together. Then let's both talk about it. Is it time for us to maybe bring them in and have a face-to-face conversation now? And our face-to-face conversation would be a jam-packed full day where you're going to talk to lots of people on my leadership team. You're going to talk to people that are at lower levels in the organization so that they can begin to understand, even though you may be my direct report, how do you treat and work with others that may be underneath you or maybe so far underneath you that you don't even know that they're there? And
Yeah.
what's the feedback that they have? Do you treat them with a level of dignity and respect? Because that's important to me. Each person contributes to the overall success. Dignity is going to give them the ability to contribute at a high level if they understand that people respect what I'm doing and what I'm bringing to the table, even though it may be
Yeah.
just taking the trash out and sweeping the floor.
Absolutely. This is actually following back on the back on this, on your last mention of, this compatibility and building like how people fit in the culture, basically. That's what you're
Mhm.
talking about, I think. I mean, it's okay and it's easy to manage when you have like 10, 20 people company. Everybody knows everyone. You can
Mhm.
easily, just go, okay, let's talk to, I don't know, let's talk to Julia, let's talk to James, there,
Mhm.
if there are any problem.
Mhm.
But the moment you get like big, 50, 70 people or more, it's the time when it's statistically read somewhere that you kind of stop knowing everybody's name in the company, right? So
Mhm.
you have to build system, and that's what you
Yeah.
talked
Yeah.
about in the beginning.
Yeah.
And you have to, because you were directly involved in this, I mean, like operations, maintenance, health and safety,
Mhm.
purchasing, I would even
Mhm.
imagine you were
Mhm.
part of. So in building these systems, what approach did you use? I mean, what is your principles of building these new systems when you go like way from small teams? Now I have not a lot of people, and then you're gonna have more. So these, that these systems you're building probably will not survive next year or two because you will like double or triple your headcount.
Yeah.
So you will need to build new.
So there's some things that are systems, you're right, and they need to start very simple and basic and just meet the fundamental needs because they're going to need to grow. They're going to need to adapt themselves, and maybe you can scale them to a certain point. But at some point you go, that's not going to fit with where we're at right now, and we're going to have to make some quantum jump to some new platform or some new system and style. But the fundamentals that really should always be a constant that you have to start early on is culture, the foundational culture that everyone begins to see. Essentially, what is the constitution of this organization? What are the things that we value and that we see as areas that you can't violate? And they're really behaviorally focused. And for me, that's one of the areas that I look at quite early. What are the areas that you need to create that culture? And it usually starts with values. What are the values that both myself, I find to be universal. Doesn't matter what company, what organization that you're in. And then you as a leader have to become the role model for others of demonstrating as best you can all of those values all the time. And you have to talk the values constantly to everyone so that they understand this is not some hokey baloney that people are just putting out there so they can check some box and say, we've done this, and okay, we've created value statements, and we'll talk about it in 5 years and make sure the values still align with where we're at.
Or at a corporate retreat somewhere.
Yeah. Where everybody's drinking the Kool-Aid, and so it's about, for me, and kind of going back into the Fulcrum opportunity, we were going from a company of about 12 whenever I first stepped in, very small organization, but my job was to build a team that was not at the corporate headquarters. My job was to build a team that was on the frontier, out on the outpost. And the first thing that I did was start to work on my senior leadership. And then we sat down and we says, here are the values that we think we want others to see in us, as well as how we want them to behave. And things like integrity, and not just say the words, right? Well, what does the word mean? Integrity. It's doing the right thing, even when people aren't watching. And it's a lot of interpretation of that, but then you begin to start showing people, how do you do integrity? How do you talk to people in a sincere and authentic way, especially if the business is not doing well at the moment? That's a level of integrity. That's a level of transparency. Transparency was another one that we felt strong about. Being able to have an open conversation, both directions, whether that's me as a leader having to tell people that things aren't doing well. Here's the areas that we're struggling at. Here's how we can all help contribute and move that to another place. Or the opposite side of it, whenever you sit down in an operating room with your team and they sit there and feel comfortable and protected enough to sit down and say, you know what's really messed up? This is really messed up. We need to fix this. And it becomes here's a problem, and here's a way that I think we can solve that, as opposed to a gripe, as opposed to our purchasing system is all messed up. We can't get anything we ever asked for. And it's just a venting of frustration, as opposed to I can bring things positive and negative to my management team. They will listen and they will respond. I don't always get everything I want, because there are limits to what you can do, both from a time and a resource perspective in many cases. But if you're able to have that open conversation and that transparency back and forth and the respect that goes with that, then you've gone a long way to creating what I would say is a boundaryless team, where no one sees anyone at any higher levels than themselves, or lower levels than themselves. It's just we all have different roles, and we all contribute to the success of the organization in our own way.
And I think this is important from other perspective, that especially for scale ups, I mean, when you scale, you have so many things that go wrong every day, every hour. So you need to constantly, fine tune what you're doing. And you need to fine tune it not only at your site. You might need to something goes wrong at your site, but you need to fine tune something back in headquarters, either in procurement or in something else, or in legal, legal rep or whatever. And I've seen it so many times that fails. There's so many examples now that because of lack of that communication. People, either they're afraid to speak up, or they're too frustrated to speak up, to give you feedback, or they just vent, as you said, rather than give feedback or report a problem. If that communication fails, and the moment that communication fails, you're stuck. I mean, that's it. You're at the head as a CEO or CTO. You stop getting real data of what's happening, and you cannot react. You cannot rearrange the resources appropriately. Yeah. Exactly, and that fails. And people try to focus. I've seen people trying to focus, like, okay, we need 5 more reports from people. Yeah, let's have people fill this form now, or let's have another meeting. And that's just a waste of time, mostly. And it's a waste of time because there is no value. Because, like, even if the top team, they say, okay, we need to have integrity and we're open to criticism and we like to hear your views, but when you actually try to do that and the reaction that you get is completely opposite to the values that they, or you as a CEO, as a founder, kind of proclaimed, this is when you have a problem. So I really loved what you said about, okay, you have to become the living embodiment of that values, because if you don't, nobody's going to believe them.
That's right. You have to both talk the talk and walk the walk. And if you don't, people won't follow you. I mean, they may have a job, they may do what they need to do, but they're going to ultimately probably leave the organization. And then you're going to have to go through some rehiring, retraining, adapting, all of that, which takes a lot of time and a lot of resources, or they're not going to contribute at the levels that you need them to contribute to. They're going to hit the minimums. What do I have to do to not get released? What I have to do to not have them decide that I'm taking more value than I'm providing? And so you get into that level, and now then you're only accomplishing the minimums, and startups can't win hitting the minimums.
Okay. Yes, that's absolutely true. I think established long-term organization can sustain that friction for a long, long time, especially if they have big margins. Just because the market fluctuates or there's a position, then they can afford to lose people. They can afford to have bad communication. I mean, but as a scale up, you just simply cannot afford that.
Yeah, exactly.
And what would be what apart from values and being critical, would it be anything else that you would like to single out for specifically when you're building first of a kind hardware that is critical to operations, that should be like also a priority for founders or the operational team to focus on?
Yeah. Well, I mean, especially in a leadership role, that leader needs to be at the coalface just like everybody else. They can't be the ones that are 2 steps back, or the ones that are reading the report in their office of, well, what happened? What didn't go right? Here's the recommendations. They need to be extremely active in what's going on, both so they can understand and get all of the information in an unfiltered manner, so that they can help provide some good input, learnings, resource needs that they have to address, or we can't fix this within the timing that we need to. Let's come up with an alternative plan that gets us maybe not all the way to the milestone, but how does it get us to a subset of that milestone that then we can move from there? Because startups are also a lot like sailing ships, and the wind pushes you around in different ways. So you have to, I know I'm trying to go to the west, but the wind is pushing me north right now. So then I'm going to have to tack backwards to the south, and it's a zigzag approach. And so you have to have the information to know where you're at. If you're sitting below decks looking at charts and having someone tell you, well, here's where we're at, but you don't know what the wind is, you don't know where the currents are, you don't know any of these things that are around you, you can't make good decisions. So you have to be on that coalface with everybody else. You have to be willing to do, every role that you're asking others to do, and demonstrate that not only are you willing, but here, I've got the dirty gloves to prove it, because I'm over here wrenching this valve, or I'm doing whatever I need to do with you in the field, because it's as important to me as it is to you.
This is important. I mean, it's like, so show up not only in the boardroom, but show up also on the shop floor.
It is. I mean, I describe it simply as presence. You have to have the presence, and that presence also creates that environment where people feel empowered to have a conversation with you that's very open and honest, when it's not just, hey, boss, we did a great thing, accomplished all of these things, let's pat everybody on the back, all the way to,
Uh-huh.
boy, that stunk the way we all wanted. If we'd only done this instead, maybe it would have come out different.
Coming on top of this, to Fulcrum and the fact that it's like closed the doors in 2024. I mean, of course, I could not touch on it. But tell me, what's in your opinion, the key reasons why Fulcrum failed from your perspective as an operational director. It's important to kind of have that open conversation. I think we hear a lot about success of a particular startup. We rarely hear about failures when they happen, especially if they go big. But we rarely have like a debrief, what really went wrong. Well, because we have a lot of people speculating.
Mm-hmm.
They're making, very clever face that, oh, I know what went wrong. But it's actually when you are inside and you see what really went wrong. And I think it's not always that we know what exactly was. And that's a tragedy, because that's knowledge lost for others to take action upon. Back to you. What went wrong with Fulcrum?
Well, I mean, that still goes all the way back to my mission at EdyMac, of how do you take the learnings that came from not just Fulcrum, the other startups I've been around. I've gone through three different FOAKs in my career. The first one was all the way back in 1996, when no one knew what a FOAK was. They didn't even call them that.
Yeah. I think it came to light like a couple of years ago. The term itself.
So, in my time as a consultant, I've worked with, over 7 different types of first of a kind organizations that are, anywhere from pre-seed all the way through, looking to raise a Series E. So, it runs the whole spectrum. But what was unique about Fulcrum that particularly was, an object lesson for me, was the decisions that were made that ultimately became problematic for Fulcrum were management decisions. I mean, they were not fundamental failures in technology where, you completely misused the tool that you had chosen. It was the management decisions that were made that either the thought process wasn't complete, and you looked forward to, by making this decision today, this is when I'm going to have the consequence arrive. This is when I need to make sure that I've either mitigated that decision before that consequence gets to me, because I pushed in many cases, you push your spending and your risk to the back end of the project. And unfortunately, what you find is now I'm at the thinnest part of my war chest, because I've spent a lot of it on the project. I've had a lot of other contingencies that I had to deal with before this one came. That all of these were management decisions. The most fundamental one was Fulcrum did a good thing in looking at their process and piloting it, not in a lab scale, in a real pilot plant type of an environment, so that they could then learn from that, gather the data they needed to do the engineering when they got into the next phase, and understand, does that process fundamentally work and achieve the goals that they're looking to achieve. The problem was they did see something that they needed to address in their process, and yet they didn't pilot it. They chose to say, we know how to solve that. We're going to add a major piece of equipment and step into our process, and we're just going to deploy that in the field, unproven, unconnected. So you've now put a major new piece into your process. So when you thought you had a technology readiness level that was, let's say, at a 6, because you've proven it on a pilot scale, I know not just the components, but the ecosystem is going to behave in this way. And then you suddenly throw something right in the middle of it all. Well, you're not at a TRL 6 anymore. You're at least at a 5, maybe even at a 4, because you took a major step backwards. And yet technology people will not tell you that. They won't admit that, because now then you're saying, well, we've got to step back. We've got to do more homework. We have to do some more fundamentals here before we're ready to go. And, the investors don't like to hear that, because all they see is, oh, now I got to write another check. Here goes some more money. My return on investment is starting to go down already, and so nobody wants to have that conversation. And so they all kind of look at it and say, what could go wrong? What could possibly happen? And in Fulcrum's case, I mean, and And in a certain way, yes, you can do that, but then you better have a very, very strong process of understanding what are those risks. By taking this choice now, what are those risks that I'm introducing that I don't understand? And then you better also assign some level of process contingency to that. If that doesn't work, what do I need to set aside to make sure that I can overcome this? You may have a good assessment on that. You may have missed it completely, but you're at least starting to recognize that you've introduced a risk and that you need to address that risk or be prepared to address that risk. And maybe you can solve that. Whatever unknowns begin to present themselves later with less than what you've set aside. Maybe it takes more, but you've at least thought about there's a consequence in my future. I need to make sure I'm prepared for that, as opposed to what could possibly happen here. I don't need to worry about this. Everything's so well done here. And, and in many cases, that's a bit of a founder's problem, because the founders will often know the technology more than anyone else because they've lived it for so many years, but they don't necessarily see outside of their field of vision very well because they're so focused on their technology and how it all comes together in itself. So making sure that one of the things that I tell people strongly is you need to pilot what you will deploy. And I don't mean just the steps.
Mm-hmm.
You also need to make sure you're using everything. All the equipment needs to be of a similar design as what you're going to deploy in the field. But you can't say, well, I'm going to use this compressor over here for the pilot because it's relatively inexpensive. It is a different style machine, but it's going to work for me right now because I don't want to go out and go buy something that's bespoke for our intentions here. And then you go and you put something else completely different into the mix. You've again really changed your whole TRL because now then you've introduced a new component into the system. And so, it's okay. You better assign some risk to that. You better recognize that that's a risk. And how are you going to manage that? Making sure that you do that pilot, you look at the equipment at the right levels, and you're assigning those risks as you move forward. Then deploy that. In Fulcrum's case, I mean, literally the decision of not piloting that one critical piece cost the company 10 months worth of time at its maximum burn rate. So, you're waking up every morning with a wheelbarrow full of cash, throwing it on the fire to keep warm now.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
you can't do that very long. So
No.
you have to be
And that's
very,
that.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah, that's sounds like really, really familiar.
yeah.
I mean, I want to, like you mentioned investors here. I think it seems to me that a lot of times, many problems like that, like the Fulcrum had or that I had, say, at my, when I was doing the battery scale up, could be solved if you go to investor and you kind of explain to them and you get them on your side in this. And this could be one of the toughest conversations you're going to have. So I wanted to ask you, as a chief operating officer, like, did you have those interactions with investors, or what kind of interactions with investors did you have? Because it's usually people usually with my background, who go to investors, and just have a conversation with them all the time, and then so we get really chummy, and we easygoing. But at some point in time, especially when things start go south, they want to talk to someone with a hard head on, not this guy in a suit, to actually understand what the hell is going wrong. So what was your experience with investors?
They're dependent on the investor because some investors
they're very different.
and they're very different. You're right. Some are extremely financially focused, and that's as far as they go with it, and they just look at the numbers and the spreadsheets and where things at. And so working with them, it's a bit more of trying to explain the basics around what is not going per plan, and then presenting, here's our approach to get back on track. And so those are pretty straightforward. But some investors, especially as you climb up the series in the investments, you're starting to move away from people that are more, VC focused, that are looking for quick cash in, some cash out later. It may take a little bit. They may have some patience, but they're not looking to try to help you build your business as much as providing you with the tools so that you can do the work yourself. Then the private equity people come to the table, and the early stage PE people are still very focused, somewhat like the VCs. They want to help you grow, but they're starting to look at more of the corporate structures and some of the fundamentals around that. They're not diving as deeply into the technology, but as you get to more savvy PE investors, or you even bring in someone that is from an operating type of an organization, like for instance, Fulcrum had BP, Fulcrum had SK out of Korea.
Yeah.
Two extremely strong operators in a business, and you're having an issue, so you have to sit down with their technical people to work through at a very deep dive level, understanding what are the problems, what are the solutions, what maybe do they see in something that may be in an adjacent area that can help you get to a solution set. Because in some cases, you don't have a ready-made solution of, oh, it's really easy, I just need to go grab this. It's going to take some time to deliver it. It's going to take some time to install it. And, we'll be right as rain come next Thursday. No, it takes a lot more time to do some of those things. And SK was extremely involved with, many very bright, very intelligent people out of their refining organization. So they've seen a lot of issues. They bring a lot of knowledge. They're very savvy, both technically and also business wise. Those are challenging, but they're even more challenging if you're not trying to be open and transparent about what's going on. If you're trying to, well, we had an embarrassing situation that we don't really want to talk about here. No, let's talk about the embarrassing situation where we messed this up. We misoperated this piece of equipment or whatever the issue is. So now how do we try to get past that? And again, people respond positively to authenticity and sincerity much more than they will respond to someone who is positioning and posturing and trying to, I'm going to give you what I think you need to know, and hopefully you won't ask me questions around the areas that I don't want you to talk about.
Is this something that you now in your role in EdyMac help founders with? Okay, I know you don't want to have that conversation with the investor, but I see the problem. Let me help you here. Like I will be with you in the room, or I will take the lead.
I haven't had to do that yet, but it's been a bit more around. So how do you try to create your investor deck in a way that an investor is going to look at it and not just see, oh, look, everything's bright, shiny, it's a wonderful future. What could, what could go wrong here? You need to be able to show it in both ways, right? Here's our plan and here's our objective. Here's the economics that we see coming from this. Here are the risks, areas that either we're unsure of and we need to resolve what that looks like. And here's our plan to resolve that. Or we don't know if we can resolve that. It's going to remain a risk. And we just know that we may not overcome that one part. And, that's the old, make sure that you're finished building the plane by the time you get to the end of the runway story that, startups always talk about. And it's like, well, that's great. But if you don't have a propeller, it doesn't matter if you're finished building the plane or not.
But it's expectations management. That's the right place to start, of course.
Yeah.
Startups are well known for overselling what they have. So being really insightful for me, and resonated a lot with what I saw and what I ran into myself. We have to bring this conversation to a close. And before we do that, I will ask like one or two questions in one, basically. So it's the same question you can say from two sides. Answer from whatever side you like. So there are, from your experience, there are main challenges to climate hardware. And I'm specifically mentioning climate. I know there's always chance in any hardware you scale up.
Yeah, exactly.
Doesn't matter. But climate can be a little bit specific because we're always kind of competing against incumbent technology. And we're competing not only on price costs, but we're also competing on climate impact. So what are from your point of view, the main challenges of scaling up climate tech? And what would you recommend the climate startups who are scaling or beginning to do to watch out for? What is like the thing that can bring them down, which they don't know about?
Well, to me, it starts off with you have to do the fundamentals, whether that's the fundamentals around your business plan, whether that's the fundamentals of beginning to learn and demonstrate your technology. And at some point, you're taking your technology and you're growing it to a point where you say it now has enough production capacity or throughput that I can begin. I'm less worried about the scale aspects of it and more of how can I make it more duplicative so that I can increase my overall capacity by just adding more units.
Modularity.
Yeah, the modularizing. That's right. That's right. But it starts with the fundamentals, whether it's more on your business
Yeah.
plan or whether it's on developing your technology. And again, like I said, it's about piloting that technology and getting it to an appropriate level where even if it's just demonstrating the process elements of it, and yes, you still need to make it bigger to make it economically viable, you've at least eliminated the TRL pieces of where things could fail. And now you're only having to focus on the real scale up measures, which are mechanically, how is it going to behave when it's larger and there's different forces on it than what we had in a very small size? Are the fluids and the heat going to transfer differently in a less confined space than they are with our small unit that we were working with? You're able to begin focusing on those problems now, especially for people that are very technically savvy, the ones that are super smart PhDs that really have a depth of understanding on all these engineering first principles. And you can then start to challenge them to understand what is it that we're trying to solve here and how is that behavior going to change as we make things bigger, either because now we need to strengthen and reinforce because of the mechanical properties or because of phenomena around transferring heat and mass. That are going to occur in a bigger space. So the
Hmm.
fundamentals, those are all fundamentals with doing that. So you got to do your fundamentals. And the last real piece of it is, and I see so many startups and founders fall into this as well. Denial of your own reality. You have to have a story when you're going out to your investors, and you want that story to look like the bright, shining beacon on the hill that everyone is attracted to, that it's going to be wonderful and great. And you're going to show them a couple of things that are not going to be so attractive, but you've got plans to be able to solve those. Well, as that evolves, you have to be very sensitive to maintaining your grounding in the reality of what's around you and not buying completely into the story that you have to tell others where you're saying, here's all the wonderful things, but I'm going to shy away from some of the less attractive parts. If you ask me,
Okay.
I'll tell you, but I'm not going to bring it up. And so you can't start to fully buy into your own story. You have to stay in reality, even though the tale that you're telling people may have some very stark differences behind that. And I see too many people begin to buy into their own story. And I've never seen it in happily ever after at the end. It always has a negative outcome because you lose touch with the reality.
And you don't do expectation management that way.
You do have to do some of that, but it's like managing upwards with anyone, right? But it does still come with a level of transparency behind it and making sure that you're both managing your own expectations as well as those around you.
Well, Jim, thank you very much for your very open and clear insights. And I think this is the first conversation I had on my podcast where we kind of deep dive in what actually makes operations tick.
Yeah.
Because I always said founders is like, okay, and they were talking about the challenges they have, and there are a multitude. And we spoke about investment, raising funds. Some we spoke about handling investors after having raised funds, and we spoke about challenges about finding location or getting clients. But I think the first time this is real focus on what operations really are.
Yeah.
And how many pitfalls you have and how that affects all of the other facets of organization that you're running in the building. So thank you very much for that. And I will put links to your website, to EdyMac website, and your LinkedIn in the show notes. So I encourage everyone who's working on their pilot or their pre-pilot or working on first of a kind or demo, reach out to Jim, have a conversation. I hope something good will come out of it and that we will have more successful folks coming online. Thank you very much, Jim, once again. And I hope that we will have another conversation, maybe next year, and to just, recap on what we talked and maybe on the changing landscape of the folk world.
That'd be wonderful. That'd be wonderful. Thanks, Emin. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you.